So hopefully you can now all see my screen. So I'm going to make a start. So some of you have seen me before in previous webinars. My name's Natalie and I'm the Schools Liaison Officer here at Magdalene College. And I'm going to talk to you today about the Arts and Humanities essay competition and specifically about the writing process and all that things that involves. So what we're going to look at today is getting started with writing an academic essay. So this might be something that you've come across before for instance, if you've done any coursework for any of your A-level subjects, you might have already written an academic style essay. You might have also heard about the differences between an exam style essay and an academic essay in our previous webinar, which was on the researching stage. We're also going to look at how you develop an academic argument and what that means and how you can fit it into your essay. Really important things to consider when you're hitting those top grades and getting those high marks in any sort of essay and including succeeding really well in this competition. And we're also going to look at structuring your writing. So I've had some questions in advance of this webinar about how you can structure paragraphs, how to write an introduction and conclusion. So we're going to cover all that today. And then you'll also have a chance to ask your own questions as well, if there's anything that I haven't covered in the next 45 minutes or so. It does say at the bottom here, for this webinar, we're assuming that you've done some research or you're planning to do some research and produce an initial plan for your essay. If you're not yet at that stage, we recommend you go back and watch the last webinar in this series, which is about researching and planning. And then you can use that to help get started with the writing process a bit later on. The last webinar in this series is available on our website. So if you search Magdalene College Arts and Humanities Essay Competition and scroll down that page, you'll find the last webinar in this series. And this webinar will also be uploaded to that page in a few days' time. So to get started, how do we get started with thinking about writing an academic essay? And I wanted to give you a couple of key pieces of advice here. So firstly, we want you to think about how your argument develops throughout your essay. Each paragraph should either provide further evidence in support of your argument or present a counter argument. And what this will do is it'll bring it all together and it will tie your essay together in support of this one argument that you're making in answer to the question. And so when you're writing your paragraphs, making sure you're constantly making links to that essay question and the argument that you're making in response to it. The other thing I want to point out is that you don't have to start at the beginning. If you're struggling with how to start with your writing process, just start wherever you feel most comfortable. If you're struggling with the introduction, then pick one of the body paragraphs, one of the main points you want to make throughout the essay, and start with that instead. And then you can tie it all together a bit later on. I'm going to talk about how to structure an introduction, followed by a paragraph, followed by a conclusion. But as I've said, if this order doesn't quite work for you, then you have the flexibility here to write it in whatever order you want. It's not like in an exam where you have to make sure you leave enough time to write an introduction and a conclusion. And if you're writing it by hand, it can get quite messy if you're writing it in the wrong order. With here, you're going to be typing this essay and you have plenty of time to structure it however you like and to structure your time. So please do write it in whatever order you feel most comfortable with. So here I've got some elements of a successful introduction, and I'll go through each one of these in turn as I did in the last webinar and with different stages of the research process. There's going to be quite a lot of information on these slides, so you might want to perhaps take a picture of them or make a note of some things to come back to later when you're doing your writing stage. So there's going to be quite a lot of information that I'll throw at you, but please do ask any questions in the chat if you have them, and I'll come to them at the end of this section or at the end of the webinar. So the first thing that I think makes a good introduction is an engaging first sentence. So this is something that's going to capture the reader's attention. We want you to know right from the beginning what your essay is going to be about and what you're going to argue. So in this first sentence, it could be a couple of things. It could be a really strong statement outlining the relevance of the topic or what you think of it. So a really interesting sentence that captures exactly what this essay question means and what the topic means to you and what you understand by it. That could be one way to do a first sentence. Alternatively, you could start off with a really interesting fact or statistic or something that you found surprising when you're researching to really draw the reader in. It could be a quote. Some people start with a quote from a key person, a key figure in the field that you'll be exploring. Then you could develop that a bit further and think about whether you agree with it or not throughout your essay. But I would say, please don't spend too much time on this first sentence. It is only one sentence of many throughout your essay. So if you can't find the perfect first sentence, come back to it later. It might come to mind when you've started writing, or you might find something later on. It's definitely not the most important part of your essay. If you spend way too much time on the first sentence and not enough time on the rest of the essay, it's going to go downhill quite quickly. And we would like you to keep a really good standard of writing throughout the essay. So do bear that in mind. The next part is a really brief background on the topic, and the key word here is brief. You don't have a lot of space in your introduction. I should say that there is definitely not a particular word count for any of these sections I'm going to talk about in this essay structure. You don't have to have a certain length for your introduction or a certain length of a body paragraph or a conclusion. It's whatever feels right to you. However, you will see if you look online, for instance, a lot of recommendations will say your introduction should be perhaps about 10% of the essay word count. So if you think that the essay word count is about 2,000 words or up to 2,000 words, your introduction could be about up to 200 words. If you're just over that, that's absolutely fine. Or if you've covered everything you want to say in less than that, that's also fine as well. So you don't have a lot of space here to give a background of the topic, and you don't need to give a huge amount of background. The people who are reading your essay will be really, really clever academics, and they will be lecturers in some sort of humanities subject, and so they'll probably know quite a lot about what you're writing about. So you don't need to go back to basics and explain everything about the topic and what it means, but they do want to see that you fully understood the question. So give a bit more background, explain where this topic fits into the wider subject that you're exploring, and what you mean by it, what you understand by the topic you're going to cover and the essay question. In this section, you might want to define any key terms in the question. So if there is a term from a particular literary movement or a period of history that you think requires a definition in order to progress with the essay, then include that. You could also mention any important academic debates on the topic. So if when you were doing your research, you found that 2 or 3 historians or literary critics or academics have had a really big important debate about that topic in the past, then you could, if you like, include a little bit of background on this in the introduction. And then you can also say that you'll build on it more throughout your essay. So it's like a taster of what you're going to be looking at during the essay. Then you can go more in depth in this and talk about some more secondary literature that you've had a look at throughout your researching. Again, not in too much depth, but you can mention a few of the authors that whose work you'll be engaging with. Again, this introduction is about giving the reader a taste of what's to come. You're also giving them confidence that you understand that you're not the first person to look at this topic or this question. People have done it kind of loads in the past in different academic fields, and you're building on their work. You've read it, you researched it, and you're building on their knowledge based on your own experiences and your own ideas. This could also be a good segue into your own argument. So you could say, this author said this author said this, here's what I think, and describe, where your opinion lies, which you particularly agree with or disagree with, and give some indication of your own view in relation to existing authors or people who've written about the text. Then we really want to see an overview of your essay structure. So in thinking about the introduction as a taster of what to come, we want to know by the end of your introduction what to expect from the rest of your essay. Think of it as like a preview that you might see at the start of a kind of longer piece of work. You might have an abstract where you'll have a description of roughly what the essay is going to contain. We don't need an abstract as such in this essay, but we should know what to expect from your introduction. So thinking about how your argument will develop throughout your essay, you can tell the reader, I'm going to explore this factor and then this factor and come to this conclusion. And thinking about the themes, factors, or points you'll consider. So it gives a taste of what sort of points you're going to make throughout the essay. And again, this doesn't have to be a very, very long summary, it's just a taster of what's to come. And then the next point we want to see is your academic argument. So this leads on from the previous slide where we're looking at what you're going to talk about and including all the other factors you're going to make and all the points you're going to discuss in your essay. This all wants to come together to your argument. And this could also form part of your introduction because you want to know right from the beginning what your opinion is on the question, what ultimately is your answer to this question that you're tackling. Some people would refer to this as a thesis statement. So if you were writing a longer piece of work, perhaps at university, something like a dissertation, then you might have a thesis statement. It's often used in subjects that have like experiments or a lot of scientific backing, but it can be used in the humanities as well. And your thesis statement is essentially your argument, it's what you think, it's your opinion, and you're making a really clear statement about where your opinion lies and what you're going to be arguing throughout the essay. This argument should underpin your entire essay, so keep referring back to it. You can introduce it in the introduction and say, this essay I'm going to argue this, or explain it in some other words. And then in every point that you're making, keep coming back to this thesis statement or this argument and make sure that you're referring to it constantly and that you're really confident that the reader knows what you're arguing, what your opinion is, and that it's going to be constant throughout. So you're making a really strong case in your essay for your argument. It doesn't have to be a kind of simple yes or no answer to the question. You can have some nuances or some assumptions that you've made. And that's absolutely fine. That makes your argument a bit different, a bit unique, and that's really good. Try not to make it too complex if you get kind of caught up in all the different nuances in answer to the question in your thesis statement, then it becomes very, very long and complicated. But if you can try and distill your answer down into kind of one really strong sentence or a couple of different clauses, then that'll make it a really strong statement that the reader can understand and make sense of. The next thing I want to talk about is paragraphs. So a few of you have asked about how long your paragraph should be or what makes a good paragraph. So hopefully this will help. I think that structuring a paragraph for an academic essay is very similar to the essays you might be more familiar with writing for your A-level subjects. So if you're doing any sorts of humanities A-level subjects, anything like history or English or politics or perhaps law, you'll be familiar with the writing structure for a paragraph. And this does often follow on from the structure you might have been taught lower down in school. Some people learn the PEE structure, the point, evidence, explanation. And that remains quite a good structure. You can kind of make it a bit more complex, make it a bit more interesting based on whatever you're writing about and your own writing style. But it is quite a good structure which enables you to kind of hit all these key points and make sure you're getting your point across really clearly in your essay. So how this kind of pans out in an academic essay is you might have a topic sentence which outlines your point, and this point should be very clearly relevant to the question that you're answering and also relevant to the argument that you're making in response to it. So from reading the first sentence of your paragraph, the reader should know that you're confidently answering the question and that this point is linking to your argument that you might have introduced in your introduction. Then we want some evidence. We want some evidence to support your point. So from your research, what have you read and what have you seen? What sort of things can you use to back up that point? And this can be evidence from other people's writing. So you might say, this author told me this, or this author wrote this, and here's what I think of it. Here's how it relates to my point. And that explanation, this third point, is really, really key. This is how you're building on the evidence that you've got, the examples that you've used, and developing your own argument and your own ideas about it. So even if you're using a piece of evidence that has been used before by other writers, other academics, you might interpret it in a slightly different way, or you might have some different ideas about it that makes it your own. And that's really, really good. That's showing that you're being quite independent in your thinking, you're being a critical thinker to use the sources in a slightly different way and really build on them to your own strengths. And this will help support your argument and make it really interesting and really good for the reader. So how is this different from what you're writing in an exam style essay and what you're used to writing at school? As I said in the previous webinar, you have loads of space to include a real range of points here. So whereas in an exam, you might be focusing on perhaps 3 or 4 paragraphs, whatever you have time for, that are focusing on the real main points. In this 2,000-word academic essay, you have room to include a few more points than this. There isn't a set number of paragraphs. I felt this is going to be a question that will come up later on, so I'll just cover it now. There really isn't a set number of paragraphs that you should be writing in this essay. Don't make your paragraphs too long. If you're kind of including loads and loads of explanation and you're going off on a bit of a tangent and not staying too relevant to the question, that will kind of bring you down, because your paragraphs should stay really, really focused on answering the question. And so once you think you've made your point really strongly and you've explained it, then stop. You don't need to keep going on in your paragraph with more and more information and examples if you think you've made your point. But equally, you do have room to include a few pieces of evidence if you want to. So you don't have to just include one piece of evidence for every point. Include more than one, have a few different examples, perhaps showing your point in a few different ways, or some different ways it could be interpreted. And using those really relevant pieces of evidence will help you get your point across really strongly. Your evidence might come from a range of primary and secondary sources. Again, this differs from an exam-style essay because you have the opportunity to research these sources really well and make sure that you are being accurate in recording them rather than trying to recall them from memory. And you can also talk more about that secondary literature, so things that people have written before, other academics who've written on this topic, and you can use that to really develop your writing and build on their points. And the other difference is that all evidence should be correctly referenced. So we'll come on to this in the next webinar in this series in 2 weeks' time and talk about referencing. But when you're doing the writing process, it's really, really good to keep a note of where you're getting your information from and making sure that you're giving credit to academics whose work you're using to write your own essay. So I've got quickly here what I think is a checklist for a good paragraph. This might help when you've written a draft paragraph to make sure you've hit all of these points. So I think when you're writing each paragraph of your academic essay, make sure it firstly really clearly states what the paragraph will be about, what point it's putting forward. So as I said, from that first sentence, we should know what this paragraph is going to cover and how it helps to answer the question and put forward your argument. Make it really, really relevant and make sure it's answering that question, as I've said, and that it contains one or more pieces of really persuasive evidence. So as I've said, this could be more than one. You can absolutely have room to include more than one piece of evidence for each of your points. And it might want to also engage with one or more pieces of secondary literature. So from your research, you've probably established that this question might have been answered several times by academics, or they've written on something similar. And so really engage with that in your writing. Talk about if you agree with what they've said, if you disagree, if you're interpreting the evidence slightly differently or have a different idea to contribute. This is a really good thing to include in any of your paragraphs. Make sure you've also referenced all your sources, as I've said. You should also include an analysis of how the evidence supports the point being made and how this helps answer the question. So I've talked about your persuasive evidence that you're going to include and your secondary literature, but how is that relevant to the point that you're making and to your argument, not just the topic as a whole, making sure you're making it really, really focused on answering the question. And finally, your paragraph should kind of reiterate how your point and supporting evidence contribute to your overall argument. So you can sort of round it off at the end in some way and make it a really tight and contained paragraph before moving on to the next one. And you can also make some really good links between your paragraphs as well. So some of your points might be connected, at which point it might be useful to have separate paragraphs for them, but a linking sentence that says, this is why I've said this is what the evidence I've used, and this leads me on to my next point, which is this. So you can be quite creative in the way that you structure your writing. This is definitely not a set structure that you have to use in order to write a good essay. Some of the best essays are really creative with the way that they structure themselves. But this is a really good checklist to come back to if you're not sure if the paragraph is quite hitting the spot and that you've included everything that you want to include in it. And then I'll come to the conclusion. So this is something else that often kind of confuses people about writing an academic essay, or they're not really sure how to do a good conclusion. So again, I'll talk through these points one by one. So firstly, try to avoid simply repeating your argument. So you've probably made this argument several times throughout your essay, in your introduction, in each of your body paragraphs, but try to avoid kind of simply saying the same words over and over again, getting that same old sentence to copy and paste from your introduction to your conclusion. Try and rephrase it, be creative with that. Don't necessarily change your argument. We want to have that consistency, but try and rephrase it to show how you developed it over the course of the essay and how the evidence that you've deployed all ties together to make your argument really, really strong. You don't have to use really obvious phrases like in conclusion or to conclude. You can if you want and you feel comfortable, nothing wrong with that. But by restating your argument and bringing it together, the reader will understand that you're getting towards the end of your essay. So just write it however you see fit. In your conclusion, we want you to bring all your main points together. This doesn't mean summarizing all your paragraphs or repeat each of your points in order, but you can include one or two sentences to briefly show how all your points are connected. This word connection is really important. We want your essay to be quite cohesive. So each of the points that you've made should all be relevant to answering the question and then come together to answer it. We don't want kind of 6 or 7 different answers to the question, one in each paragraph. We want it to all come together in support of your argument to make it a really coherent essay. Next, you can consider the implications of your argument. So this is completely optional. This might not fit the question that you're answering, but it could be something interesting to consider and be a good ending to your essay. So what is the significance of your argument? What might it mean for the wider field? So if you've made a really strong argument in answer to that question, can you think about how your argument might differ if it was applied to a slightly different question or a different part of the topic? Or for instance, if you're answering one of the questions that has multiple options within it, for instance, one of the questions that asks you to consider art or music or literature, and then think about, does your argument hold for the other sources that you haven't talked about? You don't have to do loads of research on this or make it a whole big part of your essay, because that's not answering the question, but it's kind of leaving the reader thinking about how your argument could be applied in different contexts. Does it raise new questions for future studies? So has it made you think about how you could perhaps explore this in answer to a different question, and where you could go next with your research? Again, this is completely optional and it's certainly not the only way to write a conclusion, but this is quite popular in a lot of academic essays as authors try and think about what they could do next with their work and what the implications of their findings could be. And then finally, leaving the reader interested in your topic and convinced by your argument. So if you've written a really strong conclusion, if you've tied your essay together really, really well, the reader will be confident in what you've argued. They understand the point you were trying to make. They'll be persuaded by your evidence and your analysis. You'll have kind of brought them onto your side. They'll understand where you were going with your analysis and why you deployed the evidence that you did. And they'll be really assured that you've considered all the relevant points and presented a coherent response to the question. So they will understand how all your paragraphs fit together, all the points that you're making, and how this all ties together to answer the question. And this will leave them really interested in your topic. So if you've done a good essay, the reader will kind of want to read more, or they'll be left thinking, they'll have some more questions about the topic, that perhaps want to research themselves. And because academics are really, really curious people, they always want to learn more about their subject. And so if you've included something really interesting that they might have not considered before, that's really, really good. That's made them interested in your topic and persuaded them to your way of thinking. So a couple of tips and tricks. If you're struggling with a paragraph, it might be because you haven't got quite enough evidence yet. So don't be afraid to return to the research stage and gather some more examples that might help with your writing. Equally, if you've got loads and loads of evidence in support of one of your points, then try and think about what is the best piece of evidence, what are the best examples which support your point and are relevant to the question. The next thing to say is that you definitely don't have to write your paragraphs in order. but do think about how they link together. So if you are starting somewhere in the middle and writing a body paragraph and wanting to reorder them as you go along, that's okay, that's fine. It can be really good for a first draft, but thinking about how you can make those connections between your paragraphs and making sure they all tie together to make your argument really, really strong. Remember to keep a note of all your sources throughout, so keeping a note of everything that you used to help you answer that question. You can make the referencing a bit tidier later on and follow the referencing styles that I'm going to talk about in the next webinar, but keeping a note of which sources that you use for each point or paragraph will really help you keep track and make sure you're not accidentally passing off someone else's work as your own, which would be plagiarism. So in the next session, we're going to look at referencing and refining your essay. So I'm going to come to some questions now. So do get thinking of them and do pop them in the chat. But just to highlight a date for your diaries, the next session will be on the 29th of March, again from 4:30 until about 5:30. And we're going to look at editing the essay and working to a word limit, and also 2 different referencing styles that you could use to write your essay. So I've had some questions submitted in advance, which I'm going to start with answering. But in the meantime, please do pop some more questions in the chat box for me, and then I'll happily stay and answer them for you. One of the questions that I've had submitted in advance is, are the essay skills we learn during this webinar series applicable to the essays we'll write on a university degree? And the answer to that is definitely yes. The reason we are doing this competition and the reason we encourage you to write academic style essays is because it's a really, really good skill for when you get to university. All these things I'm saying now are going to be applicable if you're doing a humanities degree at university. You'll have to write these sorts of essays quite frequently, and so it's really, really good practice. Similarly, someone else has asked, is essay writing a skill which most develop quite quickly into the course at university, or is it something I should work on before university? So it's definitely something that's worth getting practice of. So you might get practice of writing essays through things like doing coursework, if you're doing subjects like history or English that have coursework attached to them, or perhaps an EPQ, the extended project qualification, or the Welsh Baccalaureate if you're a student in Wales. This doesn't mean that you won't be able to write a good essay in this competition if you aren't doing an EPQ or something similar. It's just has some transferable skills you might be able to pass across, but these webinars should help everyone out regardless of what experience you have writing essays. If you don't end up with loads of experience writing essays by the time you get to university, you'll very quickly learn. As I said, you'll be asked to write lots of practice essays, and these won't count towards your final grade. They'll just be practice to get your head around the essay writing process. So you'll have loads and loads of chance to develop your writing skills. Someone else has asked, what should we take away from experiences like entering essay competitions when it comes to supercurricular activities? So really, really good question. For those of you who haven't heard of these supercurricular activities or haven't seen one of my PowerPoints before, these are things that you need to include on your personal statement to explain to universities what you've been doing so far to make you a really, really good student on the course and get you prepared for university study. So entering an essay competition like this one is a really, really great supercurricular activity because it's an example of a time that you've gone above and beyond, you've gone beyond the curriculum, beyond what you're taught in school to explore something different and to explore your subject outside of the school curriculum. Crucially, no one's making you do this. This is a completely optional competition that you've chosen to enter because you're interested in the subject. And that really shows universities that you're passionate about the subject and you want to study it further. So if you choose to write about this essay competition or any other essay competitions in your personal statement, you could talk about perhaps an aspect of the research process that you found interesting, something that you came across that you hadn't considered before, or perhaps that one of the questions made you consider your subject in a completely new light, and you could talk about that a bit as well. So really, really good question and a great thing to include on your personal statement if you'd like. And then the last question I got in advance before moving on to the chat box, how do we get support to write this essay if needed? So I definitely say watch this webinar series, catch up on the previous webinar and watch the next one as well. And also research as much as possible. As I said, if you're struggling to write the essay, it's likely because you haven't quite got enough research, you haven't got enough evidence to support your points. And so feel free to go back to the research stage and find some more evidence to support what you're trying to say. This competition is really a test of your ability to work quite independently, to do your own research, to write your own essay, which are really, really good skills for university, and also to kind of problem solve. So if you encounter a problem when you're writing an essay or you're struggling with something, we want to kind of see how you respond to that and see how you resolve it yourself. So it is quite an independent task, but there are resources out there like these webinars to help you out as well. So thank you for those who submitted questions in advance. I'm going to open up the chat box now and have a look at your other questions. Should the majority of our sources be academic work, or can articles make up the majority of references? So you can definitely get your sources from wherever you see fit. It definitely doesn't have to be all entirely what we call academic work, so works that are written by historians or philosophers or academics who write about literature. You can definitely get your information from wherever you see fit in order to answer the question. If you're engaging with secondary literature, so things that academics have written about throughout their time as an academic in relation to the topic, then you should reference this directly if possible. So try and read that work and reference it rather than referencing an article that mentions that work, if that makes sense. So definitely try and include a couple of academic sources if you can, but it does depend on the question. We have a huge variety of questions on that list, so depending on what you're answering, you can get your sources from wherever you see fit. Just remember to kind of use your own judgment about how reliable a source might be. Think about where that person's getting that information from and whether you trust it, and think about that when you're choosing which sources to include in your essay. Someone else has asked how much evidence is needed to write a successful academic essay. So again, this really differs and depends firstly on your question and also kind of what kind of essay you're writing. So in terms of the amount of evidence, I would just make sure that for every point you make, you have some evidence to support it. So making sure that you're not just kind of pulling points out of thin air and having something to back it up is a really, really good idea. Does the essay question have to be relevant to what you want to do in uni? No, it doesn't. This is a completely for fun competition. You can answer any of the questions that you want to do. I mentioned about the personal statements, and if you're writing about this essay competition on your personal statement, the question that you've answered, again, doesn't have to be that related to the subject you want to do at university, because the practice of writing this kind of essay is still a really good transferable skill for whichever university course you want to do, especially within the humanities. So do feel free to answer any question that you'd like, and it doesn't have to relate to what you want to do at university. And you might still change your mind because you have loads of time left to decide what you want to study. Much evidence is expected in one paragraph when writing an academic essay? As I've said, as long as you have evidence for each one of your points that you're making, if you're making kind of one quite simple point in your paragraph and you just have one really strong piece of evidence that backs it up, that's fine. But if you want to include examples and evidence from different areas or different sources, so for example, if you're writing one of the questions that relates to English, you might want to include evidence from 2 different books or a book and a play or something like that to show how the idea and the point can be shown in 2 different ways. So really use the space that you've got. You've got 2,000 words to write this essay, so use that space to include all the evidence that you think is necessary in order to get your points across. Are we allowed to ask teachers or others for feedback on our essay? And if so, do we need to reference it? We encourage you to treat this as quite an independent exercise. So if you want to talk to your peers about it, that's absolutely fine. But we would request that you don't ask kind of teachers to mark it for you or give you feedback, just so that everyone's on a level playing field. And this is a test of kind of how you work independently, as I've said. So kind of treat it as an experience to use your own initiative, do your own research, and make this quite an independent exercise. Yes, we've correctly answered the question about how many paragraphs you need to write. So there's definitely no limit on paragraphs. You can write as many as you feel necessary within the word count, making sure that your paragraphs are keeping to a point. So if you're thinking about how you're answering the question and you've done some research, you might, from your research, have a look at how many points you can make from that. If you can divide your research into a number of points, and then write a paragraph on each one. So again, no limit, just make sure that you're kind of dividing your paragraphs by point and tying them all together at the end. I think I've hit the end of the questions. If anyone has any more, please do feel free to pop in the chat box. As I've said, the next webinar will be on referencing and refining your essays, so please do come along to that one as well. If you've already signed up, then I will send the link out to that, as I have done today, on the day of this session. Someone else has asked, is a counter argument required? And if so, how many points for it? So you can definitely include a counter argument or several in your essay. These all kind of count towards the number of paragraphs you have and equally the point. So definitely include it as a separate paragraph if it's relevant. Or if you're making a point in one of your paragraphs and you think there is an exception to this point, so you could say this is always the case apart from this one instance, that could be a counter argument that you include perhaps at the end of that paragraph, just to show that you're being really critical about your own writing, your own points that you're making. So you can absolutely write as many counter arguments as you like, but making sure that you're either disproving them perhaps or showing that they're not quite as relevant as the overall argument that you're making. Counter arguments can be really good to kind of prove your own point, put forward your own judgment, because you're saying that some people might think this, but really here's some really good evidence for my argument that disproves that. So kind of use them to your strengths and use them for your own benefit. Someone has asked, is there a marking criteria we can access? We don't have a specific marking criteria for this essay competition, but you can see on the on our website, on the main page where you can access the questions for this competition, there is a brief description of what the academics are looking for, which is essentially a kind of academic style essay, as we've been talking about, that's researched independently, draws on different sources and is showing you've done a lot of research for it, and has a unique and interesting argument at the end of it. So there's the kind of general marking criteria that we're using for this competition, and it's very similar to anything you'd encounter if you were doing humanities A-levels and coursework subjects. We're looking for sort of strong essay writing skills, no matter what question you're answering, and showing that you've done your research to create a really good and strong persuasive argument in response to the question. So I'll just give it one more minute for any more questions to come in. Are there any exemplar academic essays available for humanities? You can definitely find example essays online and any of the sources that you're having a look at. So for instance, if you're reading any academic articles as any of your sources for your essay, those are really good exemplars. Those are how you would often write an academic essay. A lot of PhD students will submit their essays to become articles and get published. So quite often those skills will be in there. So those are some really good exemplars you can use. But in general, all the advice in this webinar and in the previous one will be, get you into writing a really good academic essay and give you that good experience.